I'm presenting on the articles, Young Children Spontaneously Recreate Core Properties of Language in a New Modality by Bohn et al. And Children Creating Core Properties of Language, Evidence from an Emerging Sign Language in Nicaragua by Senghas et al., as well as the corresponding lecture and some further research. So I'll probably be talking a little bit more on the Bohn article than the Senghas article, because just I felt like the Bohn article was more intriguing and compelling to me. I've helped with some similar related research in Christina Backer's lab, and just learned a lot about how children segment language and recreate language properties and stuff like that. I just honestly just felt like it was more interesting to me. Okay. So, move my face up here now. So before I get into describing these articles, why is it significant is a big question. And the Bohn et al. Article stated that human social and cultural life rests on a unique set of communicative abilities. So these newly emerging communication systems provide a window into the into the cognitive and interactional basis of these skills, which suggests that language-like communication systems can emerge rapidly out of social interaction. Okay, so first the Bohn article. It's mostly unknown how the world's 6,000 plus natural languages have arisen, yet one of the great discoveries in the human sciences in recent decades is the finding that among spatially isolated deaf persons brought together in a community, they can rapidly create new conventional sign languages, which offers insight into the dynamics of language evolution. However, documenting the emergence of these languages has mostly consisted of studying the end product. So the processes by which ad hoc signs are transformed into a structured communication systems has not been directly observed. So here they show how young children create communication systems that exhibit core features of natural language in less than 30 minutes. The speed in which children create the structured systems has profound implications for theorizing about evolution as well. Okay, so their hypothesis and goal. So their initial hypothesis is that children use structure to cope with increased complexity in the scenes to be depicted. So for example, a larger number of agents and relations. So their goal is to test if children can recreate core properties of language, which are the referentiality, conventionality, arbitrariness, and grammatical structure. Okay, let me move my face once again over here. So for their methods, this took place in Germany with 198 children of different ages. They did one experiment with 4 and 6-year-olds, which I'll probably be mainly talking about because the other ones were follow-up studies. So they repeated it with 3 and 4-year-olds and 6 and 8-year-olds in follow-up studies. They recruited children from a database whose parents volunteered to take part in studies of child development. So their study design unites the strengths of previous approaches. So in a controlled laboratory setting, participants played a reference game in which one child had to communicate the content of a picture to another child. While the researchers blocked the possibility of using spoken language, the children were free to use whatever form of communicating that they deemed suitable because they had no further instruction beyond the training phase. So basically, the children were placed in different rooms, the production room and the comprehension room, which you could see, I put the pictures from the article, so you could see an animated picture of the rooms. So where was I? So they communicated via a video channel. Candidate pictures were presented on a wooden board. The task of the child in the production room was to communicate the content of the selected picture to the child in the comprehension room. Then the child in the comprehension room had to select a picture from the board that they thought was the correct one. All experiments started with a training phase in which the child, in which the video as well as the audio connection was still intact and children could talk and coordinate, and they were given simple directions. After the trial run, the audio was cut and the children were told to play the same game in a different way, but they were not told that the audio would be cut. In each test trial, children had 1 minute to establish communication. Oh, there we go. Okay. So methods continued. After a short training phase in which the children could convey the meaning two verbally established common ground, and after the auditory connection was cut, this situation was called the initiation phase, which allowed the researchers to assess whether children could spontaneously find any way to express the content of the picture. Towards the end of the game, the children switched roles, the center became the receiver, and vice versa. So, and this was called the uptake phase. All right, so now moving on to the results. Okay, so for referentiality, the majority of 6-year-olds spontaneously had already produced gestures in trial 1, more so than the 4-year-olds. 4-year-olds initially needed prompts to produce gestures, but they needed fewer prompts in later trials, showing that they transferred the idea of iconically depicting a referent to new pictures. For the uptake phase, children of both ages spontaneously used iconic gestures from trial one onward, often adopting the signs that their partner invented. There was no difference between the age groups at the first trial of this phase. The results show that once a child established a way of referring to the pictures, the other child easily picked it up. So turning to comprehension, they found that gestures were understood at a very high rate and improved with every trial. All right, next. So results for the abstract concepts. To see if children would be able to communicate more abstract concepts rather than just concrete pictures, the researchers introduced a plain white picture, which was like nothing or empty. And that was over the course of the session. So both 4- and 6-year-olds spontaneously produced intentional gestures for this item and did not differ for both phases, the initiation and the uptake. This suggests that children were able to successfully communicate more abstract concepts using the newly created gesture. All right, so next, the results for conventionality. All right, so a signature of mature languages is conventionality. Speakers within a community use the same signs for a different referent. In emerging sign languages, conventionality emerges only once home signers join in larger communities. So home signers are communication systems built, home signs are communication systems built up out of common gestures used with family members. So to assess whether children within a dyad use more similar gestures than children from different dyads, the researchers asked naive adults to make similarity judgments for gestures from the same dyad compared to gestures from a different dyad. These individuals are known as the raters. So for both age groups, raters judged gestures from the same dyad to be more similar. In direct comparison, gestures were rated slightly more similar for 6-year-olds compared to 4-year-olds, but nevertheless, both age groups produced more similar gestures within than between the dyads. What was interesting as well was that partners adopted their sender's signs, copying even the subtle differences. As senders generally comprehended signs that they had just used, copying greatly increased successful communication. All right, next. Results for arbitrariness, which is the last one for this study. So to see if children's gestures became more arbitrary over time, they compared the first and the last gesture for a given picture from each child. Raters were instructed to select the gesture that they deemed more abstract, which means less reminding of the picture, like less iconic. So an explanation for gestures drifting to the arbitrary over time is that iconic elements are dropped from the gesture to save effort as they become unnecessary for efficient communication. Therefore, the researchers also asked the writers to indicate which gesture was more effortful. The results were that the later gestures of the 6-year-olds were rated more abstract more often as compared to the 4-year-olds. All right, now, so that was it for the Bohn article. So now on to the Senghas article. So once again, a new sign language has been created, this one by deaf Nicaraguans over the past few decades or so, providing an opportunity to observe the inception of universal hallmarks of language. Certain properties of language are so central to the way languages operate that they were termed design features of language by Hockett. Okay, so for the introduction, the study asks whether these properties can arise naturally as a product of language learning mechanisms, even when they are not available in the surrounding environment or language environment. They focus here on 2 particular properties of language, which are discreteness and combinatorial patterning. And together, these properties make it possible to generate an infinite number of expressions within a finite system. Also, these basic elements are perceived categorically, not continuously, and are organized in a principled hierarchical fashion. All right, so for the general methods, the present study compares the signed expressions of 30 deaf Nicaraguans. 10 from the first cohort, which were before 1984, and these cohorts are organized by the year that they were first exposed to NSL. And then 10 from a second cohort, which was 1984, and between 1984 and 1983, 10 from a third cohort, which were after 1993. All participants have been signing NSL for since at least the age of 6. And then all signed expressions were compared to the gestures produced by 10 hearing Nicaraguan Spanish speakers while speaking Spanish. All right, some more methods. Sorry. Specifically, the researchers examined the gestures and signs in expressions that describe complex motion events, such as rolling down a hill or climbing up a wall. And they chose the descriptions of motion for 2 reasons. One being that the previous research has found that when speakers describe motion events, they produce co-speech gestures that iconically represent the movement. Another is that description of motion offers a promising domain for detecting the introduction of segmented, linear, and hierarchical organization of information into a communication system. All right, so for their procedure, to collect samples of signing and gesturing that describe motion events, the researchers presented participants with an animated cartoon and videotaped them telling the story to a peer. The deaf subjects signed their narratives while the hearing subjects spoke Spanish, and only their co-speech gestures were analyzed. Those expressions that included both manner and path information were coded with respect to how the information was integrated, so either simultaneous or sequentially. Simultaneous is a single hand movement to gesture or sign the motion. So like one sign to sign what's happening and the motion it's taking, if that makes sense. While sequentially means articulated separately within a string of simple manner only and path only elements. So like the manner and then the path it takes. So like roll and then they said descending. Okay, so now for the results for the simultaneous part. All Spanish speakers gestures, and most of the first cohort signers worked with the older individuals. Their expressions use the manner and path simultaneous approach. Second and third cohort signers produce relatively fewer expressions with this approach. This means that younger signers are doing an approach much more similar to how we use language in a spoken way, and the older signers gesture more iconically. Okay, so the results for the sequential portion. So the sequential pattern was never observed in the Spanish speakers' gestures. First cohort signers sometimes included such sentences, and then second and third cohort signers include such sentences in most of their expressions, as you can see in this picture. All right, so for the discussion for the Senghas article, overall the analyses reveal a qualitative difference between gesturing and signing. In gesture, manner and path were integrated by expressing a simultaneously and holistically, by expressing them simultaneously and holistically, similar to the way that they occur in motion itself. And in younger signers, manner and path are signed sequentially, which may almost kind of get lost maybe in translation because you don't know if those events are supposed to be together or if they're independent, such as like rolling and descending. But it is also a fundamental language technique because it allows for the production of an infinite set of utterances within a finite system. Like you can break apart different elements and rearrange them into various other sentences. So like kind of like building blocks or Lego sets or something like that. So that's basically the gist of this article. So a topic that was brought up in the Senghas article was language and learning. Was language and learning abilities and what shaped what. So like did languages shape learning or vice versa? And it is speculated in the Senghas article that it was a combination of the two. But I wanted to look more into the environment and social interactions and how they shape language learning, because in the Bohn article, it states that language-like communication systems can emerge rapidly out of social interaction. They also say how older studies show that cultural evolution also play a role in language development. Okay, so that leads me to the first article. Oh, you can't really see the title. Let me move my face again. That's perfect. Okay. Leads me to the first additional article that I chose, which was titled How Social Contexts Support and Shape Language Development by Eric Hoff. This article stated that human potential for language development is based in human biology, but makes requirements of the social environment to be realized as well. So this paper reports evidence regarding one, the nature of those environmental requirements, two, the way in which the varied social contexts in which children live meet those requirements, and three, the effects of environmental variability in meeting those requirements on the course of language development. So in some cultures, children are talked to a great deal, and in others, very little. Also in some cultures, children typically observe or can observe how like adults' conversations and how they communicate to each other, but in others, children are less frequently witness to adults' interactions. So the author looked into this variability. She also wanted to find a universal base of language development. So the theory here is that the universal contextual supports for language acquisition include the opportunity of communicative interaction and an analyzable language model. She then goes on to list the ways that environments vary in order to test the universal theory. So she looks at literature in the following areas: cultural influences on language environments and language development, influences of socioeconomic status, or SES, on language environments and language developments, influences of ethnicity, multilingualism, the influence of age of the caregiver, birth order, influences of child care experience, of school, conversational settings, peers, influence of television, and the influence of parents on language environments and language development. And then the results here indicate that there is evidence that all environments provide children with opportunities to see language used for communicative purposes and to hear samples of speech, which makes the hypothesis plausible, obviously in addition to genetic properties. Oops. Okay. Now, the next article I chose was The Emergence of Grammar, Systematic Structure in a New Language by Sandler et al. This report contains a linguistic description of a language created spontaneously without any apparent external influence in a stable existing community. So sometime in the first decade that this new sign language emerged, systematic grammatical structure has also developed. And the sign language is listed there. I just can't pronounce that. So they have found that one of the most important organizing principles in language is the grammatical relation between subject, object, and verb in an utterance, and has been fixed at a very early stage in the development of the language. So in this study, there were 8 signers, with 7 being deaf and 1 hearing. They were about in their 30s and 40s. So for all tasks, the signers addressed another signing member of the community to ensure that their language was produced in a communicative context. 2 tasks were presented to the signers, one being spontaneous narratives given in response to a request to recount a personal experience, and 2 being the descriptions of single events portrayed by actors in a series of short video clips, and so their responses were recorded. The researchers found statistically significant structural regularities in the order of signs in the language. So these are subject, object, verb orders within sentences and head modifier orders within phrases. An example of the subject, object, verb sequence is woman, apple, give. So woman being the subject, apple being the object, and give being the verb. These word orders cannot be attributed to the ambient spoken language because no one speaks like woman, apple, give, which is pretty interesting that it was only in this sign language. Okay, so now on to the next one. So lastly, I chose The Development of Causal Structure Without a Language Model by Lilia Risman and Susan Golden Meadow. I chose this because I found it interesting that they actually only studied 1 child. This article addresses whether a child not exposed to structured linguistic input could create linguistic devices for encoding causation, and if so, whether the emergence of this causal language would follow a trajectory similar to the one observed for children, to the one observed for children learning language from linguistic input. They observed the spontaneous gestures of an American homesteading boy from the Philadelphia area who had 11 sessions with the researchers. They identified 3 main gestures that the child made: deictic, iconics, and conventional gestures. Deictic gestures serve to index an object in the environment and have the form of either a point or an object hold up. So, and then in iconic gestures, the form of the gesture encodes some physical property of the gesture, of the object or action it represents, and the conventional gestures have a fixed association of form and meaning known to the individuals in the child's hearing community, such as nod for yes, shake for no, that kind of thing. So from the pool of the child's iconic gestures, they identified those gestures who function as verbs. as opposed to nouns or adjectives. The researchers then coded all the verb gestures. They found a striking U-shaped curve where use of handling hand shapes in causative contexts was initially high, and therefore seemingly similar to patterns found in established sign languages, followed by a dip during which the child used many non-handling hand shapes to describe causal events, followed finally by a rebound in use of handling hand shapes to the initial level. All right, so, oops, whoa. Let me move my face one more time. Okay, so how this topic gives insight into the field of cognitive science. So overall, the topic here offers unique insights into how numerous individuals varying in many different aspects develop, recreate, and use language properties. With this, I think the topic draws upon the linguistic and possibly the education subfields of cognitive science amongst others. And then I found that the Hoff article was most compelling because of the universal hypothesis mentioned in her paper and how the hypothesis could be plausible considering all the varying influences a child has, while developing language. So that is all for my presentation. So please let me know if you have any questions. Just email me and I will leave the references here for you to see, and I'll also cement the PowerPoint as well.